Hi, I'm Trent England with Save Our States, where we defend the Electoral College because we care about the integrity of our republic and our elections. I'm here today with Jarrett Stepman. He is the author of The War on History and a columnist at the Daily Signal. Jarrett, thanks so much for being on the podcast today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Why don't we start off with you? Just share why you're interested in politics, in history. Why does this matter to you?
I think it's something that's always mattered to me. I think it's the way I was raised. I grew up in a family where teaching about American history and being an informed patriot, I think that's what Ronald Reagan called for, was something that was very important to my family. I think that was the education that I grew up with. And I think that's always motivated me. I think having that basis of an understanding of American history, I think really gave me throughout life this desire to preserve a system that I think has been the greatest in the world, is certainly for the purpose of human flourishing. And I think it's important, especially now, is I think large parts of that system, our political system, are being undermined, are being fundamentally changed. I think it's important for those who do have a knowledge of our history and have a knowledge of what this country was built upon, really push back on a lot of those changes and make sure that this country continues to be the free republic that we were bequeathed by the founders and by the generations of Americans who came before us.
Jarrett, you write a lot at the Daily Signal. You write for other outlets. You have this book out, The War on History. What's your favorite topic to write about, and why?
Well, I mean, I guess you could say, favorite topic is maybe not necessarily a happy one. I do write quite a bit about the attacks on American history, how American historical figures, ideas are being perpetually undermined in the public sphere. I'm not sure if it's necessarily a happy topic. I'm certainly happy to inform American people, especially about figures from our past that maybe aren't very well understood or known anymore. I think this country was built upon the backs of a lot of giants, many of whom, obviously the men like George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, very well known, but there are plenty of others too who aren't so known to the American public, who played an enormous role in creating our country, this free country. I think that's what really gives me joy, is bringing some of that history, especially when we have so many attacks that even the greatest figures now are coming under scrutiny, to be able to enlighten the public about those figures and about our history, and to explain why this country ultimately became as great as it has. I do enjoy that very much. I think that's an important part of my work, especially because I do so much studying in the field of history and American history, world history. I think bringing those topics to a general audience and discussing that is definitely one of my favorite parts about being a writer.
There's a lot of talk about vaccines right now, and I sometimes think about history as an inoculation, that if we really understand history, it's not that it determines exactly what we'll think, obviously, but it's sort of an inoculation against the worst ideas that come along. I don't know. Do you think that's right? Am I overly optimistic there?
No, I think it really is. I think that's when you spend a lot of time in history and seeing that, well, nothing is new under the sun, so to speak, and understanding, kind of the broader context of the world in which we live in. I think it's one of the frailties of the modern age, and to a certain extent, Americans have always been people very much looking that are very much looking forward. And I think that's a good part about who we are. But I think there's this kind of tendency in modern life to forget what happened even 5-10 years ago, let alone 200 years ago. And especially reading about, people from those times and how they dealt with a lot of issues, they sound like people just like us. They're dealing with very different contexts of the times in which they live in, but dealing with the struggles of their own day and dealing with, their worries, their concerns, their beliefs about, human nature, I think is incredibly, enormously valuable. Seeing things from a different point of view than just the modern day, the 24-hour news cycle. I think that's remarkably valuable to anybody, not just for those who are experts or those who are very narrowly focused on studying parts of history, but I think just being citizens of a republic. I mean, I think we should know what our origins are. We should know a little bit about how this world has worked. I think that informs us as far as the decisions that we make for ourselves going forward.
So what will people find if they haven't read the War on History yet? They should. What will they find in the book? Give us a thumbnail sketch, a teaser.
So I lay out the kind of origin of a lot of these, I think, attacks that are now happening on America's past, on our history. I mean, it really is, and I think I really laid this out in the book. It really is an attack on every element of what made America America. I mean, starting with, and I start the book out speaking about Christopher Columbus and his discovery, and of course, Christopher Columbus is one of the figures who is very much under attack, but really making my way through American history, those kind of cornerstone events and the arrival of the Pilgrims and Puritans in America, the founding of the Republic, the Civil War generation up to World War II, kind of describing what the American country has really become through its history and how all those things are under attack, all the things that make us us. Are under siege right now. And I think what's very sad is there are very few defenders. I mean, really, I think when you look at the Ivy Leagues, you look at a lot of our elite institutions, they are completely unwilling and apparently at this point unable to defend what America was built on, the things that made us so prosperous, made us so privileged. That is one of the great, we are a privileged people because of those that came before us and built on a lot of these institutions. And I try to highlight that in this book, that America was never a country that was perfect or was always without fault. Certainly not. But we do have a great legacy that we've built on from the very origin of this country. It's something good and worth preserving. And I lay out the history of that country, and I lay out the attacks, where they're coming from, why they're so pernicious, why they're going to lead us to becoming something that is very, very different, I think, and unfortunately, a whole lot worse.
So I know you've written on the Electoral College in the past. Obviously, that's what we do here at Save Our States, is defend this particular part of our Constitution. And there's all of this talk about election policy right now, which I think is fascinating in how unmoored it is from history, and the fact that some of the legitimate progress we've made as a nation is getting people to where they can vote in person, in private, have a secure system. What are your thoughts on some of these battles over the Electoral College and all of this rhetoric we hear about elections and how it needs to change?
Yeah, it really is incredible. I think some of the attacks we've heard about the Electoral College, and I think part of it is just the fact that many people don't even know what it is. I mean, you get that a lot. A lot of people don't understand why it's been put in place, why it's been so successful. I think there's this modern ethos that because this thing just needs to be thrown out overnight because people didn't get their way in a recent election. I think that is an incredibly short-sighted ethos, especially when you look at the history of the United States, the stability of our elections. It's one of the miracles of the American Republic. I mean, that's something that is what American has been quite exceptional in its history, and the fact that the Electoral College has been so successful over time. There are no real specific attacks other than the idea that, it's anti-democratic, it's this or that. But was George Washington not a great president? Was Abraham Lincoln not a great president? If you're telling me that the system is fundamentally flawed, and yet many of our presidents of the past in our early history were electing a system that in some ways was less democratic than today, were among the greats in human history. There's no accounting for that. I think in these attacks on the Electoral College, there's no explanation of why the system has been so successful and has worked for so long. And so again, that goes back to this misunderstanding of history, this inability to go back and say, well, there's a reason these things exist and they've actually functioned quite well. These arguments about why it changed overnight seem to be, I think, for the purpose of short-sighted political gains. I think they're missing the longer trend of American history and world history, the success that system has brought us as a country, as a free people.
Of course, a lot of this gets wrapped up in the language of race and accusations of racism. Those things are leveled against the Electoral College, against from some people, there, the allegation of racism basically just means something that they don't like. What do you say to that as someone who's studied and written about American history? I mean, obviously we have, we some of our greatest failings as a nation have had to do with racial slavery and racism and Jim Crow. So how do you respond to that kind of rhetoric?
Well, it really is incredible when you're talking about an institution like the Electoral College. I mean, it's become such a common attack, and I think that's one of the worst attacks on the Electoral College, to say, well, this institution was simply created because of slavery. I think it's a way to malign it and make it automatically discredited in the minds of the American people. You don't actually have to attack the system itself; just simply call it racist and dismiss it. And I think that really goes to, I think, the frailty of a lot of the arguments against the Electoral College. They can't simply stand on their own. They can't simply say, I disagree with the Electoral College because I disagree with how it works or how it's structured. Instead, they go to, well, no, actually, it's just racist. Just get rid of it. And I think that really goes to, I think, some of the simplicity of some of the arguments that we have in the modern era. The movement to simply label anything that we disagree with as racism, even if it's something that really on its face doesn't seem to have any connection to it whatsoever. I think that's a really pernicious way that modern Americans often argue about these issues. We should be able to use, reason and debate. That's what this country in large part was founded on. Simply maligning an institution and trying to drag it into discussions about race or whatnot, I think does a short shrift to the arguments about why it exists. And I think and there have been a few historians who have tried to link the Electoral College to slavery. I think that some of that has been in bad faith. And frankly, the historical record, I think, doesn't show, especially when you're talking about the institution of slavery, a connection between the Electoral College and preserving slavery. I think that those two issues, I mean, when you look at the debates at the Constitutional Convention, the Electoral College was almost never mentioned in terms of slavery. There were a lot of other issues that went as a part of it, and I think those are certainly worth discussing. But to simply call it racist and dismiss it, I think is a lazy way of arguing about this issue. And I think, unfortunately, look, it's become very. It also undermines what things that are genuinely racist, and it makes it so that these arguments become completely ridiculous.
So where do we go from here? I was somewhat optimistic 10 or 15 years ago. HBO had made the John Adams miniseries, which was outstanding in my opinion. The biographies of the founders were at the top of the New York bestseller list. Very, very frequently. News broke that Hamilton was going to become a musical, which at first was very confusing, but turned out, again, in my opinion, to be pretty amazing. And I thought it just seemed like there was this pent up interest that the American people had in our history that maybe was linked to a recognition that it really hasn't been provided to us. And yet now, it seems like the folks who have been sort of holding it back have doubled down, and they're trying to just tear it down. Where do we go from here?
It is amazing how fast it's escalated in a very short amount of time. I mean, it's not just critiquing specific parts of American history, it's critiquing every part. I mean, really at its root. And that certainly was what I was trying to get at in my book on the War on History, that this is not simply about any specific figure. It's not just about Columbus. It's not just about Confederate statues. When we see attacks now on Abraham Lincoln, there's a high school in San Francisco, California, in which they're talking about removing the name of Abraham Lincoln as well. I mean, I think a lot of those who are attacking American history see the whole thing as inherently wicked and bad. It was rotten at the core. It's rotten at the seed. I think they wish to create some kind of cultural revolution in America in which we throw off the ugly past and rebuild at year zero. I don't think that's going to work very well. I think that already there is a backlash building against these things. I mean, don't get me wrong. I think a lot of our, especially elite institutions in America, have bought into this line. I don't think that the American people as a whole have yet. I think many of them see this and they're blindsided, they're shocked. I think they're often bewildered. I think they see these discussions about American history go to canceling George Washington And I think that they're amazed that it's gone this far. I wish more had paid attention to the attacks that have been, I think, happening for really a generation, especially those that now happen in America's college universities and our K-12 education. The seeds of this have been laid a long time ago. I think they're bearing fruit now. Um, to me, the hopefulness that I have in the future is that there will be a backlash to these things. Do we want to live in a country in which all aspects of our past, both the good and the bad, are abandoned, and it's replaced by something that I think is going to be very ugly? It's going to be very tyrannical. It's going to be very much opposed to the traditions of liberty and a free society that far too many take for granted in this country. And I think that, preserving our history now and taking a stand and fighting for it and saying, you know what, I'm not going to let you cancel these greats of our past. We're fine discussing, the failings of the past. We're fine discussing how the past has sometimes not been what we like. But we should do that rather than simply canceling it, simply erasing it, which is, I think, what many want to do, because they want people to forget. They want people not to know anything other than the line they're being given. I mean, that's, it's not about pursuing the truth. It's about, I'm going to tell you my truth, and I'm going to give you a narrative. Don't you dare seek out what that truth really is. And I think that's what's been very scary about this moment, I think, in American history, about cancel culture, about the attacks on statues in history and fellow Americans. But my hope comes from the good sense of the American people, who I think don't buy into all these things. And I think there will be a pushback. I think there'll be a very serious one. It takes courage. It takes somebody to say, I'm not going to buy into this. I'm going to draw a line in the sand. You're not going to take away George Washington, and you're not going to convince me otherwise. And I think if more Americans, have the ability to feel courage, and they know that they have support from their fellow Americans, I think this movement will dry up very quickly. It's just a matter of having that courage, having that bravery, and having institutions that can fight against a lot of our others that have been so corrupted.
Well, and talking with Jarrett Stepman, your book, The War on History, I think provides people with the intellectual ammunition to engage in that fight and to win it. Last question, who is your favorite American founder and why?
Well, it's always going to be, for me, George Washington. I mean, he is the man of the revolution. His example that he set, as far as not only taking responsibility, being the adult in the room, leading a lot of very young men who were part of that revolution, taking that burden of responsibility on his shoulders, believing in the cause itself, and of course, very famously stepping away from power, is such a unique thing in human history. George Washington, and I always argue, is greater than many of the greats who were sometimes better generals, sometimes more brilliant thinkers. George Washington was really the man, the indispensable man of the American Revolution, who set the tone really for what this country would be. That this is a nation of laws and not men. It's a nation built on the concept of freedom, of liberty. George Washington took those responsibilities and then gave the power of this country back to the American people. And I think that's, especially when you study history. I mean, most great men in history have been tyrants. George Washington was not a tyrant. He was a great man who believed in liberty and fought for that. And so, believe me, I have admiration for a great number of the founders of this country, and I will vociferously defend Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, whatnot. But George Washington, I think, has always been the man of the revolution. He really is the father of our country in the truest sense. And he's a special part of what made America America. What made us, I think, the envy of many, and a country, that started as a very small one at the edge of the world. It grew to this incredible great power. We have George Washington, men like him, to thank.
Jarrett Stepman, columnist for the Daily Signal, author of The War on History. Thanks so much for joining me. I'm Trent England with Save Our States. Thanks for watching.